consider their desires, they consider what are the other options they could substitute, they consider how much money they've got, and they consider their own self-interest when they try and buy something. Well, that's precisely what I'm talking about here. That's precisely what demand is. Just that people thoughtfully sit down and try and contemplate what the possibilities are, and then they go out and buy accordingly. It's reasonable to think that most people consider their own desires and the amount of money that they've got on hand. And as long as that's reasonable, this model is reasonable too. Now, of course, most people don't walk out there with supply and demand curves and all of these relationships in mind. But if people look for the goods they prefer at the lowest possible price, and if firms adjust their production in response to changes in price, then people and firms are acting according to supply and demand. It's also true, as economists have long pointed out, that when there's a model of behavior, it doesn't have to be exactly identical to how people think. Imagine, for example, that you were trying to predict the speed and the arc of a pass from a football quarterback to a receiver. So you would use all these equations. You would use equations from physics about the weight of the ball and the force of gravity and the speed of the wind and all that kind of stuff. Now, a quarterback who throws a football doesn't know any of those equations, but they keep accurately throwing the ball over and over and over, accurately to where they want to. Similarly, economists believe that this idea of supply and demand captures what firms and people actually do, just in the same way that equations of physics capture what a quarterback does, even if it doesn't capture the thought process of what's happening. A supply and demand framework is an extraordinarily useful way of thinking about why prices are at the levels that they are, and why the prices might be rising or falling. It's an explanation that works for all sorts of products in markets all over the world at all different times of history. A lot of the complaints about markets and how they work, people don't like it that the prices for some things are high or low. They don't like the distribution of income, poor and rich. They might not like some of what is produced, fatty food, junk television. They don't like thinking about people are being selfish. I am not claiming in any way that any of this is likable or morally attractive or humanly desirable in some deep philosophical sense. I am only claiming that supply and demand is useful. It is a useful and powerful way of describing and understanding what actually happens, what actually determines the prices and outputs of goods. And as a useful mechanism, it applies extremely well across countries, across different goods, and across history.